Welcome to Phantom Tales, where chilling stories come to life. If you enjoy tonight's tale, please like and subscribe. It really helps. Let me know where you're listening from, and get ready for a night of suspense and mystery. Let's begin. The YouTuber was a legend in his niche. Known for his fearless explorations of caves in some of the most remote and treacherous places on Earth, his channel boasted millions of subscribers. Each video was a mix of breathtaking visuals, claustrophobic tension, and his calm, measured voice narrating every step. His name was synonymous with the word adventure, and his motto, "The deeper you go, the closer you get to truth," echoed in the hearts of his fans. Then, one day, he vanished. It began with an announcement on his channel, a cryptic teaser trailer titled "The Descent, My Most Dangerous Journey Yet." The video was simple, just a shot of the entrance to a jagged cave nestled in a desolate mountainous region, surrounded by dense fog. His voiceover spoke of rumors, of strange phenomena deep within the cave, and of the many failed attempts to explore it. "This is the most mysterious cave I've ever encountered," he said. "Some say it's cursed, others claim it's bottomless, but I'll find out the truth." The screen cut to black, with a promise, "Coming soon." But that video was the last anyone ever heard from him. Days passed, then weeks. His fans began flooding his channel with comments, worried about his silence. His social media accounts went dark. Search and rescue teams reportedly combed the area where the cave was located, but they found nothing, not even his equipment or car. The story became a sensation, covered by news outlets and speculated about in forums. Some believed he had an accident and was trapped deep underground. Others whispered that he had discovered something he wasn't meant to and had paid the price. For me and my friends, the mystery was impossible to resist. We had been fans of his channel for years, and the idea that he had disappeared without a trace haunted us. One evening, while scrolling through the endless theories on Reddit, my friend Caleb turned to me and said, "What if we went there ourselves?" At first, I thought he was joking, but the more we talked, the more the idea took root. By the end of the night, there were 4 of us ready to go: me, Caleb, Emily, and Jordan. None of us were experts, but we were young, adventurous, and eager to find answers. The journey to the cave. The cave was located in a remote mountain range, miles away from any civilization. The drive took hours, and as we climbed higher, the air grew colder and the fog thicker. By the time we reached the base of the trail leading to the cave, the sun was already setting. The path was rugged and overgrown, as if it hadn't been used in decades. It took us another hour of hiking to reach the entrance, and when we finally stood before it, a chill ran through me. The cave was exactly as it had looked in the video: dark, jagged, and unwelcoming. "This is it," Caleb said, his voice tinged with excitement and fear. "This is where he went." We set up a small camp outside, waiting for the morning to venture inside. But that night, strange things began to happen. The first night. As we sat around the fire discussing our plan, we heard it, a low, guttural sound coming from the cave. At first, we thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't natural. It was a deep, rhythmic hum, almost like chanting. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered, clutching her jacket. We all nodded, too unnerved to speak. The sound continued for what felt like hours, stopping only when the fire began to die out. None of us slept that night. The descent. The next morning, armed with flashlights, ropes, and a GoPro to document our journey, we entered the cave. The air inside was damp and cold, and the walls seemed to close in on us the deeper we went. At first, it was uneventful. The cave was silent except for the sound of our footsteps and the occasional drip of water, but as we descended further, we began to notice strange things. The walls were covered in markings, symbols carved into the rock that none of us recognized. They weren't like any language we had ever seen, but they seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. "What is this?" Jordan asked. tracing one of the symbols with his finger. "No idea," I replied, snapping a photo. Then we found the first sign of him, a torn piece of fabric stuck to a jagged rock. It was the same color as the jacket he had worn in his teaser video. "He was here," Caleb said, his voice shaking. We pressed on, the passage growing narrower and more treacherous. The deeper we went, the stronger the feeling of unease became. It was as if the cave itself was alive, watching us. Then we heard it, the same humming sound from the night before, but this time it was coming from deep within the cave. "We should turn back," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We've come this far," Caleb argued. Reluctantly, we continued, following the sound until we reached a massive chamber. The air was thick and suffocating, and in the center of the chamber was something that froze us in our tracks. A camera. His camera. It was propped up on a tripod, pointing toward the far wall. The screen was cracked, but the memory card was still intact. "We need to get out of here," Jordan said, his voice panicked. But before we could move, the humming grew louder. The walls seemed to vibrate, and a shadow appeared at the edge of the chamber. It wasn't a person. It was something else, something that defied explanation. The shadow moved closer, and as it did, the temperature plummeted. Our flashlights flickered, and the air was filled with a sound I can only describe as a scream. Long, piercing, and inhuman. We ran. The escape. I don't remember how we made it out of the cave. It was a blur of terror, of scrambling through the darkness with that awful sound chasing us. When we finally burst into the daylight, gasping for air, we didn't stop running until we reached the car. We never spoke about what we saw in the cave, but I couldn't let it go. When we got home, I checked the memory card from the camera, hoping it would provide some answers. The footage was shaky and dark, but it showed him, descending into the cave, narrating as he always did. Then, in the final clip, he turned the camera on himself, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "If you find this," he said, his voice trembling, "leave. Don't go any further. Some places aren't meant to be explored." The screen cut to black. I deleted the footage. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. It started with a friend request. After a long day at work, I collapsed onto my couch, scrolling aimlessly through my phone. Notifications buzzed every few minutes, messages, likes, and updates I barely cared about. Then a new notification popped up, a friend request from someone named Rachel Moreland. I didn't recognize the name, but her profile picture caught my attention. It was an old, faded photograph of a group of people standing in a foggy forest. They looked off. Their faces were hard to make out, but something about the image sent a chill down my spine. Curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked on her profile. It was almost empty. No posts, no visible friends, just a handful of photos. They were all similar to her profile picture. Blurry, aged snapshots of various places, abandoned houses, shadowy hallways, dense woods. There was no caption or context. I hesitated, but eventually clicked accept. It felt harmless enough. After all, it was just a Facebook friend request. That night I couldn't shake the strange feeling that lingered after accepting her request. Something about her profile gnawed at me, but I brushed it off, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. The next day, things got weirder. I woke up to a single message in my inbox, from her. It was just one line. "Do you remember the house?" Confused, I stared at the screen. "What house?" I typed back a quick response. "I think you have the wrong person." Her reply came almost instantly. "No, it's you." A cold knot formed in my stomach. Who was this person? I clicked on her profile again, hoping to find some clue, but it looked different now. There were more photos than before. Photos of places I recognized. My apartment building. The park I walked through every morning. Even the coffee shop I visited the day before. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she lived nearby. Maybe these were just coincidences. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Her next message came before I could block her. "Come back to the house." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. What house? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. And then I remembered. When I was a kid, there was an old, abandoned house at the edge of town. It was the kind of place that kids dared each other to visit, shrouded in local legends about ghosts and disappearances. One summer, my friends and I snuck in, armed with flashlights and the bravado of youth. The house was a crumbling ruin, filled with broken furniture and peeling wallpaper. But in the basement, we found something that still haunted me. A small room with strange symbols scratched into the walls. In the center of the room was a wooden box, locked tight. We didn't stay long. Something about that place felt wrong, like the air itself was pressing down on us. One of my friends dared to touch the box, but before he could open it, we heard a noise, a low, guttural sound that sent us running. We never went back. Now, years later, this stranger on Facebook was talking about the house. How could she know about it? I typed out a message, my hands shaking. "Who are you?" Her reply chilled me to the bone. "You opened the door. You have to finish it." I didn't sleep that night. Every noise in my apartment felt amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed again. It was another message from her. "Look outside." Against my better judgment, I walked to the window. The street below was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. But then I saw it. A figure standing across the street, staring up at my window. I stumbled back, my heart racing. When I looked again, they were gone. That was the last straw. I deleted her from my friends list and blocked her account. But the damage was done. The next day, I started noticing things out of place. Drawers left open, lights flickering, strange noises in the middle of the night. And then, the photos started appearing on my phone. They were the same kind of photos that had been on her profile, blurry, distorted images of dark, empty places. But now, they were taken inside my apartment. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call the police. What would I even tell them? That a ghost on Facebook was stalking me? Her account was gone when I tried to find it again. But the messages didn't stop. Every night at exactly 3 a.m., I received the same message. "Come back to the house." It was as if the house was calling to me, demanding I return. And maybe, just maybe, it was the only way to end this nightmare. So, one cold, gray morning, I packed a bag and drove to the edge of town. The house was still there, hidden behind overgrown trees and rusted gates. It looked smaller than I remembered, but no less ominous. I stepped inside, flashlight in hand. The air was thick with dust and decay, and the floor groaned beneath my weight. Every step felt like a descent into madness. The basement was exactly as I remembered it. The strange symbols on the walls had faded but were still visible, etched deep into the plaster. And in the center of the room, the wooden box still sat, untouched. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. But I couldn't, not anymore. With trembling hands, I reached for the box. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and the symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light. The lid creaked as I pried it open, revealing nothing. The box was empty. And then the door slammed shut. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. The last thing I heard before everything went black was her voice, whispering in my ear, "You should have stayed away." I woke up in my car, parked miles away from the house. My phone was in my lap with one final message displayed on the screen. "It's not over." I never went back to the house, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the notifications. It was supposed to be a simple purchase. I had recently moved into a new apartment, a small but cozy space in the heart of the city. The living room was almost perfect, except for one glaring issue: a bare corner that begged for something unique. Not just any piece of furniture. I wanted something with character, something that told a story. That's how I found myself at O'Malley's Antiques, a dusty little shop tucked away on a quiet side street. The store was a treasure trove of history, crammed with old furniture, clocks, mirrors, and knickknacks. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and age. It was in the far corner of the shop, half hidden behind an ornate coat rack, that I saw it. A small, intricately carved wooden chest. Its surface was dark and polished, adorned with swirling patterns that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Something about it drew me in. "Ah, you've got an eye for the unusual," the shopkeeper said as he approached. He was an older man with a thick accent and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "That piece has been here for years. Beautiful craftsmanship, isn't it?" I nodded, running my fingers over the smooth surface. "What's the story behind it?" The shopkeeper hesitated. "Well, it's old, that's for sure. Came from an estate sale, but beyond that, I can't say. People don't ask too many questions about things like this." The price was surprisingly low, and I didn't think twice. Within the hour, the chest was sitting in the corner of my living room, filling the space perfectly. That night, the dreams began. The first night. I didn't think much of it at first. Everyone has strange dreams, right? But this one was different. Vivid, suffocating. I was standing in a dark, windowless room, surrounded by shadows that seemed to shift and breathe. In the center of the room was the chest, its lid slightly ajar. Something moved inside it. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The chest sat silently in its corner, as if mocking me. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The patterns on the chest's surface seemed different. The swirling carvings were sharper, more defined. I could have sworn they hadn't looked like that before. Shrugging it off, I went about my day. But when I returned home that evening, I found deep scratches on the floor around the chest as if it had been dragged. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but nothing else in the apartment was disturbed. The locks were intact, and I was the only one with a key. I tried to push the unease out of my mind. Maybe I had moved it without realizing. Maybe the chest had settled into the floor somehow. But as the days passed, the strange occurrences multiplied. The whispering. The whispering started on the third night. I woke up in the middle of the night to a faint sound, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. It seemed to come from the living room. I held my breath, straining to listen. "Let me out." The voice was soft, barely audible, but it was there. I grabbed my phone and crept into the living room, my heart hammering in my chest. The chest sat in its corner, still and silent. I turned on every light in the apartment and stayed awake until dawn. The discovery. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to return the chest to the antique shop. But as I prepared to move it, something caught my eye. A small hidden latch on the side that I hadn't noticed before. Curiosity got the better of me. I pressed the latch, and with a soft click, a secret compartment slid open. Inside was a bundle of old, yellowed papers tied with a ribbon. The handwriting was spidery and faded, but I could make out enough to piece together the story. The chest had belonged to a woman in the early 1900s. She had been an artist, reclusive and eccentric, known for her strange and unsettling paintings. According to the notes, she claimed the chest was her muse, the source of her inspiration. But the notes grew darker, more frantic, as she wrote of hearing voices and seeing figures in the shadows. The last page was a single, chilling sentence. "I cannot destroy it. It will not let me." The haunting escalates. That night, the chest came alive. I woke to the sound of splintering wood. Stumbling into the living room, I froze. The chest's lid was wide open, and the carvings on its surface writhed like living things. From inside, a cold, foul-smelling wind poured out, carrying with it the sound of whispers, dozens of them, all overlapping. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, slowly, something began to rise from the chest. It was a shadow, darker than the night, with no discernible form but an overwhelming presence. It loomed over me, filling the room with a crushing sense of dread. "Let me out," it whispered again, the voice from my dreams. Somehow, I found the strength to run. I grabbed my car keys and fled, leaving the chest and my apartment behind. The aftermath. The next morning, I returned with a friend, determined to get rid of the chest once and for all. But when we entered the apartment, it was gone. The corner where it had sat was empty, the floor smooth and unmarked. There was no sign that it had ever been there. I tried to track down the antique shop, hoping to confront the shopkeeper, but when I returned to the street, the shop was gone too. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. To this day, I don't know what happened. I moved to a new city, far from that apartment, but the memories linger. Sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers, and I wonder if I'll ever truly be free of the chest. And if you ever find yourself in an antique shop, staring at a piece of furniture that seems too perfect, too unique, I have one piece of advice. Leave it where it is. It started with Eric's obsession. Eric had always been a horror junkie, the kind of guy who knew every obscure slasher film, every trivia fact about cult classics, and had shelves lined with DVDs, VHS tapes, and memorabilia from decades of terrifying cinema. For Eric, horror wasn't just a genre, it was a lifestyle. We used to joke that he was one creepy mask away from becoming a slasher villain himself. But despite his enthusiasm, there was something harmless about his passion. It was just movies, after all. That's what I thought, anyway. One weekend, Eric invited me over to check out his newest haul. He'd found a dusty box of old horror tapes at a flea market, a treasure trove for someone like him. The tapes had no labels, just black VHS cassettes with faintly scuffed surfaces. "They're probably old bootlegs or forgotten indie films," Eric said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Who knows? Maybe there's a lost masterpiece in here." The first tape we played was strange. The quality was poor, grainy, and washed out, as though it had been recorded decades ago on an ancient camcorder. It opened with shaky footage of a forest at night, lit only by the pale glow of a flashlight. A woman's voice whispered something, too faint to understand, and the camera swung wildly, capturing glimpses of twisted tree trunks and something moving in the shadows. Then came the screams, raw, blood-curdling screams that didn't sound fake. Eric was thrilled. "This is amazing," he said, leaning closer to the screen. "It's like found footage before it was a thing." But something about the tape unsettled me. The screams sounded too real, too visceral, and the way the camera moved felt frantic, desperate. This wasn't the stylized horror I was used to. When the tape ended, there were no credits, no indication of what we'd just watched. "Let's try another one," Eric said, already reaching for the next cassette. The second tape. The second tape was worse. This one started with a static-filled screen, accompanied by a low hum that made my teeth ache. The image flickered, and then we were inside a decrepit house. The camera panned slowly through dimly lit rooms, each one filled with strange, unsettling objects. A doll's head with empty eye sockets, a mirror cracked down the middle, and walls covered in scribbled symbols. In the corner of one room, a figure stood facing the wall. It didn't move. "Dude, this is next-level creepy," Eric whispered, his excitement undiminished. I didn't respond. My attention was fixed on the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. The figure finally turned and the tape cut to black. Eric rewound the tape, determined to get a better look at the figure's face, but when he pressed play, the screen filled with static. The tape wouldn't work anymore. "That's weird," Eric muttered, but he didn't seem concerned. "Old tapes do that sometimes." I wasn't so sure. The nightmares. That night, I had nightmares. I dreamed of the forest from the first tape, of running through the darkness while something chased me. I couldn't see it, but I could hear its footsteps, heavy and relentless, always just behind me. When I woke up, the room was freezing, and my heart was racing. I checked my phone. It was 3:17 a.m. The next day, Eric called me, his voice unusually subdued. "You won't believe what I found on the third tape," he said. "What is it?" "You need to come over and see for yourself," he said, then hung up before I could respond. The third tape. When I arrived at Eric's apartment, he looked haggard, his usual enthusiasm dulled by something I couldn't quite place. Without a word, he pressed play on the VCR. The third tape began in complete silence, the screen pitch black. Slowly, a faint light appeared, revealing a room that looked disturbingly familiar. It was Eric's living room. The camera moved jerkily, as though held by someone who didn't want to be seen. It lingered on the shelves of horror memorabilia, on the posters covering the walls, on the box of tapes sitting on the floor. Then it turned toward the couch where Eric was sitting, watching the tape. I shot a glance at Eric, who was staring at the screen, his face pale. This isn't possible," he stammered. On the tape, the camera moved closer to Eric. He looked up, directly at the lens, his expression turning to terror. The screen went black. Eric hit rewind, his hands trembling. "We were watching this last night," he said. "I was sitting right there. How could anyone have recorded this?" I didn't have an answer. The shadow. Over the next few days, Eric became obsessed. He watched the tapes over and over, searching for clues, convinced they held some deeper meaning. But something was changing in him. He stopped answering his phone, stopped leaving his apartment. When I visited, the place was a mess, the blinds drawn tight, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and uneaten food. "The tapes are connected," he said, pacing the room. "They're showing me something, but I don't know what it is yet." I tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. He was convinced the tapes were some kind of puzzle he had to solve, and then, one night, he disappeared. The final tape. I found the last tape in his apartment sitting on top of the VCR. There was a note beside it, scrawled in Eric's handwriting. "This is the last one. Don't watch it." But of course, I did. The tape began with static, then cut to footage of the forest from the first tape. This time, the camera moved with purpose, as though it knew exactly where it was going. It reached a clearing, where a wooden table stood in the center. On the table was Eric. He was lying motionless, his eyes wide open, his face frozen in a look of absolute terror. The camera lingered on him for what felt like an eternity before panning up to the trees. In the shadows, dozens of figures stood watching, their faces hidden. The tape ended, and the screen went black. I destroyed the tape that night, smashing it into pieces and throwing it into the dumpster behind my building. But it didn't matter. I still hear the hum of static in the dead of night, still see the figures in the corners of my vision, and sometimes when I close my eyes I see Eric's face staring back at me. I don't know what was on those tapes or where they came from, but one thing is certain, they were never meant to be found. I've always been drawn to abandoned places. There's something hauntingly beautiful about them, the way nature reclaims what humanity leaves behind. I'd explored crumbling mansions, forgotten train stations, and empty factories, but nothing could have prepared me for the forgotten carnival. It started with a casual conversation at work. A colleague mentioned an old amusement park on the outskirts of town, a place that had been closed for decades. "It's still there," he said, "hidden in the woods. The locals say it's cursed or something, but I think it's just creepy." A cursed carnival? It sounded too ridiculous to ignore. That weekend, I grabbed my flashlight, a camera, and a backpack and set off to find it. The directions were vague. Something about a dirt road past the old gas station, then a trail that wound through the trees. By the time I reached the edge of the woods, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The carnival revealed. The carnival was exactly where he said it would be, hidden deep in the forest, shrouded in mist and overgrown with ivy. The rusting skeletons of rides loomed in the darkness, their shadows distorted by the flickering beam of my flashlight. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No birds, no insects, just an oppressive, unnatural quiet. Even the crunch of leaves under my boots felt muffled. I wandered through the park, snapping pictures of the decaying attractions. The Ferris wheel stood frozen, its cars dangling precariously. The carousel was missing most of its horses, and the few that remained were grotesque, cracked and faded, their painted eyes staring blankly. But it was the fun house that drew me in. Its facade was peeling. The once bright colors faded to dull, lifeless hues. A grinning clown's face loomed above the entrance, its mouth wide open in a frozen laugh. Something about it made my skin crawl, but I couldn't resist the pull. I stepped inside. Inside the fun house. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of mildew and decay. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The mirrors were cracked and smeared with grime, distorting my reflection into grotesque shapes. I should have turned back when the floor creaked beneath me, but curiosity pushed me forward. The deeper I went, the more the mirrors seemed to move on their own, shifting and bending as though alive. Then I heard it, a faint, high-pitched giggle echoing from somewhere deeper inside. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the sound was nothing more than the wind slipping through cracks in the walls. But the giggle came again, louder this time and closer. I quickened my pace, desperate to find the exit, but the corridors twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. It felt like the funhouse was shifting around me, trapping me inside. That's when I saw it. At the end of the hallway, illuminated by the faint glow of my flashlight, stood a figure. It was a clown. Not the cheerful kind you see at birthday parties, but something darker. Its makeup was smeared, its costume tattered and stained. The red of its painted smile bled into the pale white of its face, creating an unsettling, jagged grin. It tilted its head, watching me with unblinking eyes. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, we just stared at each other, and then it moved, slowly, deliberately, taking a step toward me. I turned and ran. The hallway seemed endless, the mirrors distorting everything around me. The clown's footsteps echoed behind me, steady and unhurried, as though it knew I couldn't escape. I rounded a corner and slammed into a wall. No, not a wall, a mirror. My own terrified face stared back at me, and behind it, the clown loomed closer. I screamed, pounding on the glass, but it didn't shatter. And then I woke up. The curse. I was back in my apartment, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. It took me a moment to realize I was clutching something in my hand, a small, tarnished ticket stub. I didn't remember bringing it home. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. My reflections didn't quite match my movements, lingering a second too long or smiling when I wasn't. At night, I heard faint giggles coming from the bathroom mirror, and once, when I glanced at it in the dark, I saw the clown staring back at me. I smashed the mirror, but it didn't help. The giggles followed me wherever I went, growing louder each night. The return. Desperate for answers, I returned to the carnival. It was exactly as I'd left it, untouched by time. The funhouse stood silent, its clown face grinning down at me. I stepped inside, clutching the ticket stub like a talisman. The corridors twisted and turned, but this time, I didn't get lost. The funhouse led me straight to a room filled with mirrors, each one reflecting a version of me. Some younger, some older, some twisted and monstrous. And in the center of the room stood the clown. It held out a hand, beckoning me forward. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. "You bought a ticket," it said, its voice high and mocking. "The ride's not over yet." The mirrors shattered, and darkness consumed me. The aftermath. No one knows what happened to me that night. My friends found my apartment empty, the mirrors smashed, and the walls scrawled with symbols they didn't understand. But sometimes, late at night, they hear faint giggles echoing from the corners of their rooms. And if they look closely, they might see me, in their reflections, standing just behind them, with a jagged grin that doesn't belong. It started as an ordinary summer, the kind of summer where time seemed to stretch endlessly and every day was hotter than the last. I had just moved into a small lakeside cabin, seeking solitude after years of city life. It wasn't much, a modest wooden structure with creaky floors and windows that groaned against the wind. But it was mine. The lake was the real draw, a vast, mirror-like surface that reflected the dense forest surrounding it. I'd been told by the locals that the lake was nearly bottomless, a remnant of some ancient geological anomaly. There were stories, of course, whispers of strange happenings, of people disappearing into its depths, but I dismissed them as small-town folklore. I spent my days reading on the porch and my evenings watching the sun sink behind the trees. At night, the silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the mournful call of a loon. But then the dreams started. The first one was vivid, too vivid. I was underwater, the lake above me shimmering with an unnatural light. Something moved in the darkness below, a shadow too large and too fluid to belong to any creature I knew. It glided closer, and just as it began to take shape, I woke up gasping for air. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild in a new place. But the dreams didn't stop. Each night the shadow grew clearer, its presence heavier. It wasn't just in the lake anymore. It was in my cabin, behind my walls, pressing against my windows. One evening, unable to shake the unease, I decided to take a walk. The moon was high, casting a silvery glow over the water. As I wandered the shoreline, something caught my eye, a faint ripple in the otherwise still surface of the lake. I stopped, staring, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing on the far bank. It was tall and gaunt, its silhouette sharp against the trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice thin in the night air. The figure didn't move. I told myself it was a trick of the light, that I was tired and letting my dreams bleed into reality. But as I turned to head back to the cabin, I heard it. A low, guttural sound that resonated deep in my chest. I quickened my pace, the sound following me, growing louder and more distorted. By the time I reached the cabin, I was running. Inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding. The cabin felt different, colder, darker. My flashlight flickered as I moved through the rooms, checking every window, every corner. Nothing. But when I returned to the living room, I froze. The windows were covered in condensation, though the air inside was dry. And in the center of the largest pane was a handprint. Long, thin fingers splayed wide, the impression dripping as though it had been made with water. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I considered leaving, but something about the lake held me there. It was as if it had its own gravity, pulling me closer despite the growing dread. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself walking to the dock. The water was unnaturally calm, the surface reflecting the fiery colors of the sunset. I sat on the edge, my feet dangling over the side, and stared into the depths. The shadow was there, waiting. It moved slowly, circling just below the surface. My breath hitched as it rose higher, the details becoming clearer. It wasn't a shadow, it was a figure, humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its face featureless save for two pale, unblinking eyes. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. The figure reached out, its hand breaching the surface of the water. "Come back," it whispered, the words rippling through the air like a distant echo. I stumbled backward, breaking the spell. The figure sank into the depths, its pale eyes the last thing to disappear. That night, I barricaded myself in the cabin, but the whispers followed me. They came from the walls, from the floorboards, from the very air. "Come back," they said. "You belong to us." By morning, the cabin was unrecognizable. The walls were damp, the wood warped and blackened. Every surface was slick with moisture, as though the lake had seeped inside. I packed what I could and fled. But the lake didn't let me go. Even now, miles away in a crowded city, I feel its pull. The whispers haunt my dreams, the pale eyes watching from every reflective surface. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of water dripping, though there's no leak to be found. I had always been a night owl, drawn to the quiet hours when the world seemed to pause. My apartment was modest, a one-bedroom unit on the outskirts of the city, where the only sounds were the occasional hum of passing cars and the faint murmur of distant trains. It was the perfect place to be alone with my thoughts, or so I believed. It started on a Friday night, one of those endless evenings where sleep felt like an impossibility. I was flipping through TV channels, searching for something, anything, to distract me from my restlessness. Most of the stations were the usual fare: sitcom reruns, infomercials, late-night news. But as I scrolled further, I landed on something unusual. The screen flickered with static, and then, just for a second, an image appeared. A dimly lit room, empty except for a single chair in the center. The picture was grainy, the colors muted, but something about it sent a chill down my spine. Before I could process what I was seeing, the screen cut back to static. I assumed it was a glitch, maybe an old broadcast bleeding through. But when I tried to change the channel, the remote stopped working. The static grew louder, the sound morphing into a low hum that filled the room. And then, the image returned. This time, the chair wasn't empty. A figure sat hunched over, its face obscured by shadows. Its hands rested on its knees, long fingers tapping rhythmically. The tapping grew louder, synchronized with the static, creating a hypnotic, almost oppressive rhythm. I leaned closer, trying to make out the figure's face, but the screen flickered again, and the figure was gone. I turned off the TV, my heart pounding. But even with the screen dark, I could still hear the tapping. It was faint, as if coming from the walls or beneath the floor. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my imagination, but the sound didn't stop until sunrise. The next day, I avoided the TV altogether. I kept myself busy, cleaning the apartment, running errands, anything to keep my mind off the strange experience. By the time night fell, I convinced myself that it had been some kind of electrical interference, a glitch in the broadcast. But when I returned home, the TV was already on. I was certain I had turned it off before leaving. The same channel filled the screen, the dimly lit room with the chair in the center. This time, the figure was standing, its back to the camera. The static hummed softly, almost like a heartbeat as the figure began to turn. I froze, unable to look away. The figure's face was pale and featureless like a mannequin. It tilted its head as if studying me, though it had no eyes. My breath caught in my throat as it raised one hand and pointed directly at the screen. At me. I fumbled for the remote, my hands shaking, and managed to turn the TV off. The screen went dark, but the room felt heavier, as though the air itself had thickened. For the rest of the night, I sat in silence. The image of that figure burned into my mind. The following nights were worse. The tapping returned, louder and more insistent. Objects in my apartment began to move on their own. Small things at first, like keys and pens, but then entire chairs would be out of place. Each time I turned on the TV, the figure was closer, its movements more deliberate. One night, I woke to find the TV on. Though I hadn't touched it, the figure was no longer in the room on the screen. Instead, the camera was pointed at my apartment. I could see myself sitting on the couch, staring back at the screen in horror. The tapping grew deafening, each beat like a hammer against my skull. The screen flickered, and the figure appeared in the doorway behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the TV, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. By the time dawn arrived, I had packed a bag and decided to leave. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay. As I opened the door, I hesitated, glancing back at the TV one last time. It was off, the screen dark and lifeless, but as I stepped into the hallway, I heard it again. The faint tapping, following me, growing louder with each step. I had always been drawn to the wilderness. Something about the untamed beauty of nature offered a solace that the city could never provide. So, when I had a rare weekend free, I decided to head out for a solo camping trip. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but something about this trip felt different. Exciting, maybe, or perhaps foreboding. The weather was perfect when I arrived at the forest. Clear skies, a soft breeze, and the warm glow of late afternoon sunlight filtering through the trees. I hiked for hours, my gear strapped to my back, enjoying the rhythmic crunch of leaves underfoot. Eventually, I found the perfect spot, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines with a view of a distant ridge. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and cooked a simple dinner over the flames. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest came alive with the sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves. I felt a sense of peace as I sat by the fire, staring at the stars. But then, night fell. The forest that had felt so welcoming during the day now seemed vast and alien. The towering trees blocked out most of the moonlight, and the once soothing sounds of nature began to feel oppressive, like 1,000 unseen eyes watching from the shadows. I told myself it was just my imagination and crawled into my tent, zipping it tightly behind me. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of screaming. It was sharp and piercing, cutting through the stillness of the night. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear more. The scream echoed again, faint but unmistakable, coming from deep within the forest. I told myself it was probably an animal. After all, there were plenty of creatures out here that made strange noises at night. But this scream, it sounded human. I tried to shake the feeling off, convincing myself that I was imagining things. I lay back down, pulling my sleeping bag up to my chin, but my ears stayed alert. The night felt heavier now, the silence between each distant rustle or chirp stretching uncomfortably. Then, just as I was beginning to drift off again, I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush just outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, listening intently. The steps circled the tent, pausing occasionally as though whoever, or whatever it was trying to decide what to do next. I reached for my flashlight with trembling hands, but as I turned it on, the footsteps stopped. The beam of light cut through the darkness inside the tent, but outside everything was silent again. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and eventually I managed to fall asleep again, though it was restless and filled with uneasy dreams. The next morning, the forest seemed normal again, bathed in warm sunlight. The events of the night felt distant, like a bad memory. I told myself I'd let my imagination get the better of me and decided to stay another night. The day passed uneventfully, but as the sun began to set, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. I built a larger fire that night, the flickering flames casting long shadows across the clearing. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves set me on edge, but nothing happened until I went to bed. This time, I was barely asleep when I heard it. The scream. It was closer now, louder and more desperate. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened as it echoed through the trees. Then came the footsteps again, slow and deliberate, circling my tent just like before. I whispered to myself, trying to stay calm. "It's just an animal. It's just an animal." But then, something pressed against the side of the tent. I froze as the fabric bulged inward, as though a hand, or a claw, was pressing against it. The pressure moved, sliding along the surface of the tent as though tracing its outline. I grabbed the knife I'd brought with me, clutching it tightly as I tried to keep my breathing quiet. The pressure stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. And then the zipper of the tent began to move. I screamed, slashing blindly at the fabric, and whatever was outside let out a guttural growl before retreating into the darkness. I scrambled out of the tent, flashlight in hand, and shone it wildly around the clearing. There was nothing. No footprints, no signs of an animal. Just the cold, empty forest staring back at me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, huddled by the fire with my knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. As soon as dawn broke, I packed up my things and left, hiking back to my car as quickly as possible. Even now, weeks later, I can't explain what happened. I've told myself it was just a bear or a coyote, something ordinary that my mind turned into something more sinister. But I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there, that something was watching me from the shadows. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear the faint echo of that scream. I've always been a fan of late-night Reddit scrolling. Something about the dim glow of my laptop screen, combined with the eerie quiet of the night, made the experience both comforting and unsettling. I wasn't looking for anything in particular that night, just hopping between subreddits, reading threads about everything from conspiracy theories to unexplained mysteries. But then I stumbled upon a post that made me stop scrolling. The title was simple. Has anyone ever felt like they're being watched? Online? Intrigued, I clicked on it. The post wasn't long, but it had an unnerving tone. For the past few weeks, I've noticed someone following me across different platforms. It started on Instagram, random likes on old photos, comments that didn't make sense. Then it moved to Facebook, TikTok, even LinkedIn. The messages are vague but unsettling. Things like, "I see you," or "nice outfit today." The thing is, they never use the same account twice. And the weirdest part, the accounts always disappear after they interact with me. Am I going crazy? Has anyone else experienced this? The post had been up for a few hours and already had dozens of comments. Some people brushed it off, saying it was probably just a troll or someone messing around. Others shared their own experiences, and the replies ranged from mildly creepy to downright horrifying. One comment caught my eye. "It's not just happening to you. I had the same thing last year. It started harmlessly, but then it got worse. If they've started following you across platforms, you need to be careful. Block them, change your passwords, and whatever you do, don't engage with them directly." I felt a chill run down my spine. It sounded like one of those urban legends people tell to scare each other, but the sincerity in the comments made it feel all too real. I couldn't resist scrolling further, reading every reply and imagining the fear these people must have felt. As I read, I noticed something strange. A few users in the thread had responded with nearly identical comments. "They're closer than you think. Watch your back." The accounts that posted these replies were all newly created, with no post history or profile pictures. At first, I thought it was just someone trolling the thread, but then I refreshed the page and those comments were gone. The usernames had been deleted. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach, but I told myself it was nothing, just someone trying to be edgy. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that lingered as I shut my laptop and tried to sleep. The next day, I woke up to a notification on my phone. It was a follow request on Instagram from a username I didn't recognize, @Watcher000. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. My profile wasn't private, and random follows were pretty common. But this time, I hesitated. Curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked on the profile. It had no posts, no followers, and was following only one account. Mine. I ignored the request and went about my day, trying to forget about it. But that evening, as I was scrolling through Reddit again, I received another notification. This time, it was a direct message on Instagram. You didn't accept my request. The message was from @Watcher000. I stared at my screen, my heart pounding. I didn't recognize the username, and there was no reason for them to contact me. Against my better judgment, I replied, "Who is this?" The response was immediate. "You know who I am." I blocked the account and set my profile to private, feeling a mix of fear and anger. But the unease didn't stop there. Over the next few days, I started receiving similar messages on other platforms. Each time, the usernames were different, but the tone was the same. Casual, as if we knew each other, but with an underlying sense of malice. The messages became more specific, referencing things I hadn't posted online, what I was wearing, where I had been, even conversations I'd had in person. It was as if someone was watching me, not just online, but in real life. I tried to trace the accounts, but they disappeared as quickly as they appeared. And then, one night, I received a message that made my blood run cold. "Nice lamp in your living room." I froze, glancing at the lamp next to me. It wasn't visible from any of the windows, and I hadn't posted pictures of my apartment online. Whoever was sending these messages knew where I lived. I spent the night with every light in the apartment on, double-checking the locks on my doors and windows. I even considered calling the police, but what could I tell them? That someone was harassing me online. They'd probably dismiss it as a prank. The messages stopped for a while after that, and I started to relax, thinking maybe whoever it was had lost interest. But then, a week later, I received an email. It was a single sentence. "I'm closer than you think." Attached was a photo of me, sitting at my desk, taken from just outside my window. I don't know how this will end. I've moved apartments, deleted my social media accounts, and stopped using Reddit altogether. But sometimes, late at night, I feel like I'm being watched. And whenever my phone buzzes with a notification, my stomach drops, afraid it'll be them again. If you're reading this and you've experienced something similar, please take it seriously. Change your passwords, lock your doors, and above all, don't engage. They want you to notice them. They want you to be afraid, because the moment you stop, they'll come closer. I've always had a soft spot for animals, and my cat, Oliver, was no exception. He was a sleek, gray tabby with bright green eyes and a playful personality. For months, he had been my constant companion, curling up beside me while I worked or playfully chasing after toys. But then, something strange started happening. Every day, without fail, at precisely 3 p.m., Oliver would disappear. At first, I didn't think much of it. Cats are independent animals, and I assumed he had found a quiet spot to nap or play while I was busy. But as the days went by, I started to notice the pattern. It wasn't just a random occurrence, it was as if he had a set schedule. At 3 p.m., Oliver would get up, stretch, and then calmly walk out of the room, disappearing into the house. I would call for him, but he wouldn't return until exactly 4 p.m. I tried to follow him a few times, but he always seemed to know when I was getting too close, slipping away from my sight just as I was about to discover where he was going. At first, I thought it was some strange feline habit, but the fact that it happened every day at the same time started to unsettle me. I began to wonder if there was something more to it. Did he have a secret hiding spot? Was he getting into something dangerous? Or was there something else entirely going on? I decided to investigate. The next day, as the clock struck 3, I followed Oliver as he padded out of the living room. He walked down the hall toward the back of the house, and I quietly followed behind him. He paused in front of a closet, one I rarely used. I'd never thought much of it, but now my curiosity was piqued. He didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open with a swift nudge of his head and slipped inside. I was taken aback. There was nothing remarkable about that closet, just old boxes and a few unused items. But Oliver had something in mind. I waited a few moments before creeping toward the closet. I peeked inside, and to my surprise, the cat wasn't there. The closet was empty, and I thought maybe he had simply hidden behind the boxes. But when I opened the door wide, I froze. There was a small hidden hatch in the far corner of the closet. I'd never noticed it before. It was cleverly concealed behind a stack of old books, and it appeared to lead to some kind of crawl space or tunnel. I was shaken. Why had I never seen it before? And why was Oliver so fixated on it? I couldn't resist. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and slowly opened the hatch. A musty scent wafted up, and I hesitated. What was down there? I shined the flashlight down the narrow passageway, which seemed to stretch deeper than I could see. But then, to my shock, I heard a soft meow from below. Oliver. Without thinking, I crouched down and crawled into the passage. My heart pounded in my chest as I made my way through the dark space. It was tight and cramped, and the walls felt like they were closing in. As I moved deeper, I could hear Oliver's faint meows growing louder. He was close. The passage led to a small, dimly lit room at the far end. The air was damp, and there was a faint glow emanating from some unknown source in the center of the room. My eyes adjusted to the light, and I gasped. In the middle of the room, there was a small pile of bones. Animal bones. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Why would Oliver lead me here? What had he been doing down here every day? I glanced around, feeling a wave of nausea rise in my stomach. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols I couldn't recognize. They were etched into the stone, some fresh, others faded with time. And then I saw it. A door, cracked slightly open beyond the pile of bones. I couldn't bring myself to move toward it just yet. My body was paralyzed with fear. But then Oliver came to me, nuzzling against my leg as if urging me to follow. Reluctantly, I stepped forward. The door creaked open as I approached, revealing a narrow staircase that led even further down into the earth. There was no way I was going down there. This had gone far beyond a simple curiosity about my cat's behavior. This was something dark, something I couldn't understand. I turned and hurried back through the tunnel, my mind spinning with questions. Why had Oliver been going to this place? What was it? And why was he the only one who seemed to know about it? When I emerged back into the house, I immediately sealed the hatch and locked the closet door. I wasn't sure what I had uncovered, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let Oliver go down there again. Since that day, I've kept a close watch on my cat. I've locked all the hidden passages, and I've tried to stop him from disappearing every afternoon. But no matter what I do, at precisely 3 p.m., he still gets up, stretches, and walks toward the closet. And sometimes, just as he disappears behind that door, I hear the faintest whisper of a voice calling to him. It started as a dare, like most reckless adventures do. The four of us, Jake, Mia, Sarah, and I, had always loved testing our courage. We'd done haunted houses, abandoned buildings, and even a creepy old tunnel that turned out to be nothing more than a hangout for stray cats. But that night, we were looking for something different, something truly terrifying. Jake suggested the graveyard. It was an old cemetery on the outskirts of town, abandoned for decades. Overgrown weeds and crumbling headstones made it the perfect setting for a Halloween horror movie. But the rumor about the graveyard is what made it irresistible. People said it was cursed, that anyone who disturbed the peace of the dead there would regret it. The most infamous tale was about a doll, an eerie porcelain doll that supposedly sat on the grave of a child who had died over a century ago. The story went that the child's grieving parents had placed the doll on the grave as a token of love, but over the years, strange things began happening. Visitors to the graveyard would hear whispers, see shadows moving in the corner of their eyes, and in some cases claimed they saw the doll move. It was ridiculous, of course, just another urban legend meant to keep thrill-seekers like us out. At least, that's what we told ourselves as we climbed over the rusted gate that night. The graveyard was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The moon cast long shadows, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth. Armed with flashlights and Jake's camera, we ventured deeper into the graveyard, our laughter masking the growing unease. "Where's the doll supposed to be?" Sarah asked, her voice hushed. "Near the big oak tree in the middle," Jake replied. We found it quicker than expected. The tree was massive, its gnarled branches stretching out like skeletal arms. Beneath it was a small, weathered headstone, the name and dates barely legible. And sitting on top of it was the doll. It was a delicate thing, clearly meant for a child, but time had not been kind to it. The porcelain face was cracked, one eye missing, and the once beautiful dress was now tattered and stained. Its remaining eye seemed to glint in the moonlight, almost as if it were watching us. "Creepy," Mia muttered, taking a step back. Jake, of course, was fearless. He crouched down to get a better look, his camera clicking away. "This is perfect," he said, grinning. "This is the kind of stuff that gets views." I felt a chill run down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. It was just a doll, after all, but something about it felt wrong. "Let's go," I said, my voice firmer than I intended. "We've seen it. We can tell everyone we found the haunted doll. No need to stick around." But Jake wasn't listening. "We should take it," he said suddenly, reaching out to grab the doll. "Are you insane?" Sarah hissed. "You don't take something from a graveyard, especially not this." Jake just laughed. "It's a doll, Sarah. It's not like the kid's gonna miss it." Before any of us could stop him, he picked up the doll. The change was immediate. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze moments before, picked up into a howl, whipping through the trees and carrying with it a low, guttural sound that could have been mistaken for a growl. "Put it back," Mia shouted, her voice trembling. Jake hesitated, looking genuinely unnerved for the first time. But before he could place the doll back on the grave, it slipped from his hands, landing face down in the dirt. That's when we heard it. A child's voice, faint and echoing, carried on the wind. "Why did you take her away?" We froze, our eyes darting around the graveyard. There was no one there. It was just us. But the voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. "She's mine. Bring her back." Panic set in. Jake dropped his camera and bolted, the rest of us right behind him. We didn't stop running until we were out of the graveyard and back on the main road, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" Mia whispered, tears streaming down her face. Jake didn't answer. He just stared at his hands, which were trembling uncontrollably. Over the next few days, things got worse. It started with small things, shadows moving in the corners of our rooms, faint whispers in the dead of night. Jake claimed he could hear the doll's voice, calling to him, begging to be returned. Then came the dreams. Each of us dreamt of the graveyard, the doll's single, unblinking eye staring at us as we stood frozen in place. In the dream, we could hear the child's voice, but now it was angry, full of rage. Jake was the first to break. He called us in a panic one night, saying he was going back to the graveyard to return the doll. He couldn't take it anymore, he said. The whispers, the shadows, they were driving him mad. We agreed to go with him, not out of courage, but because we were all experiencing the same terror. When we arrived at the graveyard, the atmosphere was even heavier than before. It felt like the air itself was pressing down on us, making it hard to breathe. Jake carried the doll in trembling hands as we made our way to the oak tree. But the grave was empty. The headstone was gone, the ground undisturbed, as if the grave had never existed. "No," Jake whispered, his voice cracking. "No, it was right here." As he turned to us, the wind picked up again, and we heard the voice one last time, louder and more menacing than ever. "You can't give her back. She's mine now." The doll slipped from Jake's hands and shattered on the ground. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. We ran, leaving the pieces of the doll behind. None of us spoke about that night again, but the dreams never stopped. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the faint sound of a child's laughter. And when I close my eyes, I see that doll's cracked face staring at me with that single, unblinking eye. It began on an unremarkable Saturday afternoon. I was scrolling through an online marketplace, searching for vintage movie posters to decorate my new apartment. I'd always been a cinephile, with a special love for old horror films. The stranger, whose username was Collector42, had an impressive collection of obscure memorabilia. Among them was a listing titled, Unreleased Horror Film Reel, Rare Collector's Item. The image showed an old, dusty film canister with no title, just a simple label scrawled in faded ink, Midnight Terrors. My curiosity got the better of me. I messaged the seller. "Is this legit?" I asked. Their reply came almost immediately. "Yes, but beware, this one has a reputation." When I pressed for details, they sent only a cryptic response. "Some things are better left unseen." I assumed it was a marketing ploy and negotiated the price down. By the end of the evening, the reel was mine. A few days later, the package arrived. The canister was heavier than I expected, and the smell of aged metal and mildew wafted from it. I didn't own a film projector, so I called my friend Paul. He had a home theater set up, complete with an old projector he'd refurbished. When I told him about the reel, he was eager to help. "You've probably got a piece of horror history there," he said. That night, Paul invited me over. His wife was out of town, and he seemed thrilled to have an excuse to fire up his vintage equipment. We set up the reel, dimmed the lights, and sat down with a mix of excitement and apprehension. The film opened with a black screen and a low, droning hum that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Then white text faded into view. "This film is cursed. Viewer discretion is advised." Paul chuckled nervously. "That's dramatic." The movie began with grainy footage of a small, desolate town. The camera moved slowly through empty streets, the only sound being the faint whistle of the wind. It felt almost documentary-like, as though it wasn't entirely fictional. Then came the faces. People stared directly into the camera, their expressions blank, their eyes hollow. The longer the shot lingered, the more unsettling it became. One by one, the people began to smile, wide, unnatural grins that stretched too far. The screen flickered, and suddenly those same faces were screaming, their mouths wide but producing no sound. Paul shifted uncomfortably beside me. "What kind of horror movie is this?" The scenes became more erratic. A woman in a tattered dress wandered through a forest, her movements jerky and unnatural, as if she were being controlled like a marionette. A child sat in a dark room, whispering into a mirror, but the reflection wasn't mimicking her movements. Instead, it seemed to be watching her. Midway through the film, the projector began to stutter. The screen flickered, and the droning hum from the beginning returned, louder this time. Paul cursed under his breath and went to adjust the projector. As he fiddled with it, I noticed something odd. The hum wasn't coming from the speakers. It seemed to be coming from behind us. I turned, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. "Got it," Paul said, and the film resumed. The next scene showed a group of people sitting around a dining table, their faces obscured by shadows. One by one, they began to chant in a language I didn't recognize. The chanting grew louder, more frantic, until one of them stood and looked directly into the camera. "Stop watching," the figure said, the voice distorted and echoing. Paul froze. "Did it just speak to us?" I tried to laugh it off. "Just a creepy fourth wall break. Horror movies do that all the time." But Paul wasn't convinced. He suggested we stop the film and call it a night, but I convinced him to keep going. I wish I hadn't. The final act was pure chaos. The film seemed to deteriorate as we watched, with the images becoming more fragmented and the sound distorted. Shadows moved unnaturally, and whispers filled the room. It felt as though the film wasn't just telling a story, it was pulling us into it. The screen went black, and white text appeared again. "You shouldn't have watched." The reel ended abruptly. Paul turned to me, pale and visibly shaken. That was messed up. We decided to call it a night. I packed up the reel and left, but as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I dreamt of the faces from the film, those hollow, staring eyes and unnaturally wide grins. When I woke, my phone was buzzing with messages from Paul. He said he couldn't sleep, that he kept hearing whispers in his house. He sent me a photo of his living room. The shadows in the corner looked wrong. Too dark, too solid. Over the next few days, things got worse. I started hearing faint whispers in my apartment, too, and the hum from the film echoed in my ears at random moments. Objects in my home would move on their own, and I began seeing flashes of those faces in mirrors and windows. Paul stopped responding to my messages altogether. When I went to his house, it was empty. His car was still in the driveway, but there was no sign of him. On his projector screen, the final frame of the film remained frozen. "You shouldn't have watched." I don't know where Paul went, and I don't know what to do with the reel. Part of me wants to destroy it, but another part of me wonders if that would make things worse. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the projector whirring in my living room, even though I haven't touched it since that night. And when I close my eyes, I see those faces, staring at me, smiling, waiting. I wish I had listened to the warning. It was the kind of night where silence settled over everything like a heavy blanket, broken only by the occasional hum of a passing car. I had just moved into my new apartment, a modest one-bedroom on the edge of town. The building was old but charming, with creaky wooden floors and vintage fixtures that reminded me of something out of a noir film. I wasn't expecting much from my first night there. Unpacking had drained me, and I planned to collapse on my mattress and fall into a deep sleep. But as the hours stretched on, I found myself wide awake, the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the building keeping me alert. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. I froze, straining my ears to locate the source. It was coming from the living room. My initial thought was that it must be a branch brushing against the window, but when I pulled back the curtains, there was nothing outside but an empty street bathed in the pale glow of a flickering street lamp. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. It wasn't coming from the window after all. It was coming from inside. I turned on every light in the apartment, convincing myself it was just the building settling. I even joked aloud to break the tension. "Guess the place comes with a ghost, huh?" No one laughed. Eventually, the sound stopped, and I chalked it up to nerves. By 3 a.m., I finally drifted off to sleep. The next morning, the tapping was a distant memory, overshadowed by the chaos of unpacking. It wasn't until I noticed the scratches on the wall near the living room window that the unease crept back in. 3 long, jagged marks, as though someone, or something, had been clawing at the plaster. I told myself they'd been there all along, remnants of the previous tenant. But that night, the tapping returned. Louder this time. I sat up in bed, clutching my phone. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I texted my best friend Sam about it. Me. Weird noises in the new place. Starting to freak me out. Sam. It's an old building. Probably just pipes or rats. Relax. Me. Rats don't tap in perfect rhythm. Sam. You're overthinking it. Get some sleep. Easier said than done. The next few nights followed the same pattern. The tapping would start around midnight and continue for hours, always coming from a different part of the apartment. Sometimes it was near the window, other times from the kitchen or the bathroom. I tried to ignore it, but sleep deprivation started to take its toll. By the fifth night, I was at my wit's end. That was the night I decided to confront whatever it was. Armed with a flashlight and a heavy wrench I'd found in a drawer, I waited for the tapping to begin. When it finally started, soft and tentative, like someone testing my resolve, I followed the sound. It led me to the closet in the hallway. I hesitated, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Slowly, I opened the door. The closet was empty, but the tapping was louder now, as if it were coming from inside the walls. I pressed my ear to the plaster, and for a moment I thought I could hear faint whispers, a low murmur just beneath the surface. That's when I noticed the smell, damp, earthy, like something rotting. The next morning, I called the landlord. He was a gruff man in his 60s who seemed unimpressed by my complaints. "Probably just the pipes," he said dismissively. "Or raccoons. This place is old, comes with quirks." "What about the scratches on the wall? Or the smell?" I asked. He sighed. "Look, I'll send someone to check it out, but don't expect miracles." The handyman came by later that afternoon. He poked around, banged on a few walls, and declared there was nothing wrong. "Might just be in your head," he said with a chuckle. But I knew it wasn't. That night, the tapping didn't come. Instead, I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing. Close, too close. It was coming from the foot of my bed. I bolted upright, grabbing my phone to shine its flashlight around the room. There was nothing there, but the air felt thick, oppressive. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but where would I go? The next day, I confided in Sam. "Something's wrong with this place," I said. "Maybe you're stressed," Sam suggested. "Moving is a big deal. It can mess with your head." "Stress doesn't scratch walls or breathe in your room," I snapped. That night, I set up my phone to record. If I couldn't convince anyone with words, I'd show them proof. I placed the phone on my dresser, hit record, and went to bed. The tapping started as usual, but I forced myself to stay in bed, pretending to sleep. The next morning, I checked the footage. At first, there was nothing but me, tossing and turning. Then, around 2 a.m., the tapping started. The audio picked it up clearly, steady, deliberate. But what made my blood run cold was the shadow. It appeared in the corner of the room, a tall, distorted figure that seemed to shimmer as though it were caught between dimensions. It didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. I showed the footage to Sam. "You need to leave," they said, their face pale. I didn't need convincing. I packed a bag and booked a motel for the night. But even there, I couldn't escape it. The tapping followed me, louder and more insistent. It wasn't tied to the apartment. It was tied to me. Now, I'm sitting in a coffee shop, writing this. I haven't been home in days. I've barely slept. The tapping has stopped, but the whispers remain, faint and persistent, like a song I can't forget. If you ever hear something strange in the middle of the night, don't ignore it. Don't try to confront it. Just leave. I wish I had. I had always been drawn to the sea. Its vastness, its secrets. It was a mystery I could never solve. When I inherited my uncle's cottage on the cliffs, overlooking the jagged coast and a long abandoned lighthouse, I thought it was a dream come true. It was the kind of place I'd always fantasized about. Isolated, serene, with nothing but the sound of waves crashing against the rocks. But that was before the shadows. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time cleaning the cottage, airing out the musty smell of neglect, and exploring the surrounding cliffs. The lighthouse, looming in the distance, was boarded up, its once bright light extinguished for decades. The townspeople, when I went to buy supplies, had little to say about it. "Best leave it alone," one old man muttered when I asked. "Nothing but bad luck there." I thought he was being superstitious, so I laughed it off. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the ocean. The moon was high, casting silver light across the waves. I could just make out the silhouette of the lighthouse in the distance. That's when I saw it. A flicker of light at the top, faint but unmistakable. I stared, my heart pounding. It must have been my imagination, I told myself. The lighthouse had been abandoned for years. There was no way it could be lit. The light didn't flicker again, but the unease stayed with me. The next day, I decided to investigate. The trail leading to the lighthouse was overgrown, thorny bushes snagging at my jeans as I made my way up the cliffs. The closer I got, the more I noticed how strange the air felt, thicker, heavier, as if the atmosphere itself was trying to push me back. When I finally reached the lighthouse, I saw the boards nailed across the door. They were old and weathered, but still intact. No one had been here in years. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I circled the building, looking for any sign of recent activity. That's when I found them. Footprints in the dirt, leading from the lighthouse to the edge of the cliff. The tracks ended abruptly, as if whoever made them had stepped off the edge into the void. I backed away, my stomach churning. Maybe the old man in town had been right. That night I stayed inside, locking all the doors and windows. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Every time I glanced at the lighthouse, I could swear I saw movement in the windows, shadows that shouldn't have been there. Then the knocking started. It was soft at first, a gentle tapping at the back door. I froze, my heart racing. The cottage was isolated. No one should have been out here. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the door. When I swung it open, there was nothing there, just the empty yard and the sound of waves crashing below. But as I turned to go back inside, I saw them, wet footprints leading from the back door toward the lighthouse. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, the activity escalated. Objects in the cottage began to move on their own. The chair by the fireplace would rock back and forth as if someone were sitting in it. My tea mugs would slide across the counter, leaving wet rings behind, and always, at night, the knocking. Desperate for answers, I returned to town and asked the locals about the lighthouse. Most avoided my questions, their faces pale, their voices hushed. But one woman, a librarian named Clara, took pity on me. "There's a story," she said, lowering her voice, "about the last keeper of the lighthouse. They say he went mad, locked himself inside, and refused to leave. One stormy night, the light went out and a ship crashed on the rocks. Everyone aboard died. When they finally broke down the door, the keeper was gone. Some say he jumped off the cliffs. Others believe he never left." I felt a chill run down my spine. "And the light?" I asked. "Why does it still flicker?" She hesitated. "They say the keeper's ghost still watches for ships, trying to atone for what happened." I didn't want to believe her, but the evidence was piling up. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a lantern and made my way back to the lighthouse. The wind howled around me, carrying whispers I couldn't quite make out. When I reached the lighthouse, the door was ajar. Inside, the air was damp and cold, and the smell of salt and decay was overwhelming. The stairs spiraled upward, disappearing into darkness. I climbed, the creaking of the steps echoing in the silence. The higher I went, the heavier the air became, as if the building itself were alive, pressing down on me. When I reached the top, I found the source of the light, a lantern burning brightly in the center of the room. And beside it stood a figure. He was tall and gaunt, his face obscured by shadows. His clothes were soaked, as if he'd just emerged from the sea. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. My throat went dry. "Who are you?" "The keeper," he replied, "but it's not safe for you. Leave." Before I could respond, the light in the lantern flickered and went out. In the darkness, I heard the sound of footsteps rushing toward me. I bolted down the stairs, my flashlight barely piercing the gloom. Behind me, the footsteps grew louder, closer. I didn't stop running until I was back in the cottage, slamming the door shut and locking it. The lighthouse has been quiet since that night, but I can't shake the feeling that something followed me back. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of knocking. I don't answer. The apartment was perfect, or so I thought when I first moved in. It was a spacious unit on the 4th floor of an old brick building in the heart of the city. The price was suspiciously low, but I chalked it up to the building's age. The landlord, a grizzled man in his 60s, had simply shrugged when I asked why the rent was so affordable. "People come and go," he said. "Some just don't stay long." I should have pressed him for details. The first few days in the apartment were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting used to the creaks and groans of the old building. At night, I would sit by the large bay window, sipping tea and watching the city lights flicker. It was peaceful, almost serene. Then, one night, I noticed it. A shadow in the window across from mine. The building opposite mine was much taller, its windows stretching up into the darkness. Most of the units were dark, their occupants either asleep or absent. But one window on the 6th floor glowed faintly, illuminated by a dim, flickering light. And someone was standing there, watching me. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Maybe they were just looking out at the city, the way I often did. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became that they weren't looking at the city. They were looking at me. I closed the curtains and tried to shake the feeling of unease. The next morning, I checked the window across the way. It was empty, the blinds drawn. I told myself I had imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But that night, the shadow returned. They were standing in the same spot, silhouetted against the flickering light. This time, they were closer to the glass, their figure clearer. I couldn't make out any details, but something about their posture unsettled me. It was as if they were leaning forward, trying to peer into my apartment. I closed the curtains again, but I didn't sleep well that night. The following day, I decided to ask the landlord about the building across the street. When I mentioned the 6th floor, his face darkened. "Best to ignore it," he said, his tone flat. "That place has a history." "What kind of history?" I pressed. He hesitated, then leaned in closer. "Used to be an old hotel, back in the day. They converted it into apartments about 20 years ago, but people say strange things happen there. Lights turning on and off, voices when no one's home, that kind of thing." "Has anyone reported anything unusual?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "A few tenants complained about being watched, said they'd see someone standing in the windows even when the unit was supposed to be empty. But, like I said, best to ignore it." That night, I couldn't resist. When the shadow appeared in the window again, I grabbed my phone and snapped a photo. I zoomed in, trying to make out their features, but the image was grainy, distorted. Still, something about the figure's outline sent a chill down my spine. I decided to investigate. The next day, I walked across the street to the building. The front door was locked and there was no directory or buzzer. I waited until someone exited, then slipped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of mildew. I climbed the stairs to the 6th floor, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. When I reached the unit corresponding to the window, I found the door ajar. I hesitated, my heart pounding. Then, gathering my courage, I pushed the door open. The apartment was empty. Dust covered every surface and the air was thick with disuse. The furniture was old and faded, draped in sheets. In the corner of the living room, I saw the window, the same one I'd been watching from my apartment. I approached it slowly, half expecting someone to jump out at me. But the room was silent, still. As I stood by the window, I felt a sudden chill. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from a draft. It was deeper, more penetrating. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. There, in the corner of the room, was a mirror. Its surface was tarnished. the glass warped and cloudy. But as I stared into it, I saw something move. It wasn't my reflection. The figure in the mirror was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. It raised a hand, as if reaching for me. I stumbled back, my breath hitching. When I glanced over my shoulder, the room was empty. But when I looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, the door locked behind me. I pulled the curtains tight, refusing to look at the window across the way. That night, the knocking started. It was faint at first, a soft tap, tap, tap against the glass. The long drive home was supposed to be uneventful. I'd been visiting a friend in a nearby city, and I'd left later than I should have. It was nearing midnight, and the highway stretched out before me, an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through dense forests. The headlights of my car illuminated only a few feet ahead, and beyond that the darkness felt alive, pressing in on all sides. The radio crackled with static as I tried to tune into a station, but the reception was terrible. I settled for the hum of the engine and the rhythmic sound of tires on the road. That's when I saw the first sign. It was an old, weathered billboard on the side of the road, barely visible in the dim light. The paint was faded, but the words were clear enough. "Welcome to Pine Hollow, a place to call home." I frowned. Pine Hollow wasn't on my route. I was sure of it. Shaking off the unease, I kept driving. The highway stretched on, monotonous and unchanging. The trees lining the road seemed to grow denser, their gnarled branches forming an almost impenetrable wall. Another sign appeared. This one was newer, with bright letters that read, "Pine Hollow, 5 miles ahead." I checked my GPS. The map showed only the highway with no towns or exits nearby. Confused, I decided to keep going. Maybe the signs were old, remnants of a ghost town or a community that no longer existed. But then I saw the gas station. It was a small, run-down building with flickering neon lights spelling out "Open." A single car was parked by the pumps, and a figure stood beside it, waving. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. The man was middle-aged, with a weathered face and a nervous smile. His clothes were rumpled and his hands fidgeted as he spoke. "You headed to Pine Hollow?" he asked. "No," I replied, my voice uneasy. "I'm just passing through." His smile faltered. "You shouldn't stop here," he said, glancing nervously at the dark forest. "Keep driving. Don't take any exits. And whatever you do, don't turn around." Before I could ask him what he meant, he got into his car and drove off, his taillights disappearing into the night. I filled up my tank quickly, the eerie silence pressing down on me. As I got back on the road, I couldn't shake the man's words. The signs for Pine Hollow continued. "Welcome to Pine Hollow. Next exit." Against my better judgment, I decided to take the exit. The road was narrow and winding, the trees closing in around me. My GPS still showed nothing, the screen blank except for the blue dot of my car. The town appeared suddenly, as if it had been waiting for me. Pine Hollow was eerily quiet, its streets empty and its buildings dark. The houses were old and decrepit, their windows staring like empty eyes. A single street lamp flickered at the center of town, casting long, shifting shadows. I parked my car and stepped out, the silence swallowing the sound of my footsteps. Something about the place felt wrong, as if it were stuck in time. I wandered through the streets, calling out, but no one answered. The air was heavy and the shadows seemed to move when I wasn't looking. Then I saw the diner. Its neon sign buzzed faintly, the words "Pine Hollow Diner" barely legible. Inside, the booths were empty and the air smelled of stale coffee. A jukebox sat in the corner, silent and covered in dust. On the counter, there was a single cup of coffee, steaming as if it had just been poured. I backed out of the diner, my heart racing. The town was wrong, unnatural. I needed to leave. But when I got back to my car, it wouldn't start. The engine groaned and sputtered, but it refused to turn over. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel as the street lamp outside began to flicker more violently. A shadow moved across the edge of my vision. I turned, but there was nothing there. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound like a growl. It came from the direction of the forest, growing louder, closer. I locked the doors, my hands trembling. The growling was joined by whispers, a chorus of voices murmuring just outside my comprehension. The shadows around the car thickened, pressing against the windows. And then, everything went still. The growling stopped, the whispers faded, and the shadows receded. For a moment, I thought it was over. But when I looked up, someone was standing in front of the car. It was the man from the gas station. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He mouthed something, but no sound came out. Then he pointed behind me. I turned, and the last thing I saw was a figure emerging from the darkness, its form shifting and unnatural. When I woke up, I was back on the highway, my car idling on the shoulder. The sun was rising, and the road ahead was clear. But when I glanced at my GPS, the route had changed. The destination read, "Pine Hollow, you're already here." I've always enjoyed hiking alone. There's something peaceful about being surrounded by nature, away from the constant noise of the city and the endless notifications on my phone. So, when I had a rare weekend off, I packed my gear, drove 2 hours to a remote trail I'd heard about online, and set out into the wilderness. The weather was perfect, clear skies, cool breeze, and the faint smell of pine in the air. The trail was marked well, and though it was steep in places, I was making good time. Around midday, I reached a clearing with a breathtaking view of the valley below. I sat down, pulled out a sandwich, and soaked it all in. That's when I noticed the first odd thing. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees. He wasn't dressed like a hiker, no backpack, no water bottle, just jeans and a faded flannel shirt. His head was tilted slightly, as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. I gave him a polite nod, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked deeper into the forest without a word. It was strange, but I shrugged it off. People came to the woods for all kinds of reasons. Maybe he was a local or someone who preferred solitude like me. I finished my lunch and continued down the trail. By late afternoon, the light was starting to fade, and I decided to set up camp for the night. I found a small, flat spot off the main trail, surrounded by trees. It was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. As I gathered firewood, I felt it again, that sensation of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no one there. The evening passed uneventfully. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, read a book by flashlight, and crawled into my tent around 10 p.m. The forest was alive with nocturnal sounds, and I let the rhythmic hum of crickets lull me to sleep. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the rustling leaves. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, or maybe a raccoon. But then the steps grew louder, closer. Holding my breath, I unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting long shadows across the campsite. That's when I saw him. The man from the clearing stood at the edge of the firelight, his face obscured by the darkness. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. My heart pounded as I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward him. The beam of light illuminated his face, and I felt a chill run through me. His eyes were wrong. Too wide, too bright, like they were reflecting the light back at me. His mouth twisted into a grin that was too big, too unnatural. I scrambled out of the tent, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. He didn't move. I backed away slowly, keeping the light trained on him. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the forest, moving so quickly it was almost as if he'd been pulled away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the dying fire, clutching a knife and staring into the darkness. Every rustle, every crack of a branch set my nerves on edge. At first light, I packed up my gear and started back toward the trailhead. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him again. The trail felt different on the way back. The trees seemed closer together, the air heavier. Several times I came across footprints that weren't mine, leading in the same direction I was going. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the bark of a tree was a symbol, a crude circle with an X through it. It looked fresh, the edges of the carving still raw. A few yards later, I saw another tree marked with the same symbol, and another. Panic set in as I realized they were leading me off the trail. Somehow, I'd wandered off the path without even noticing. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to shift around me. That's when I heard the laughter. It was faint at first, carried on the wind, but it grew louder, closer. It wasn't joyous laughter. It was low, guttural, and full of malice. I broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush, desperate to find the trail. The laughter followed me, echoing from all directions. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing. At its center was a small, decrepit cabin I hadn't seen on any map. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. I didn't want to go inside, but the laughter was getting louder, and the trees felt like they were closing in. The interior of the cabin was dark and smelled of damp wood. The floor was covered in dirt, and the walls were lined with shelves full of jars, each one filled with something unrecognizable. In the corner of the room stood a chair, and on it sat a doll. It was old and worn, its button eyes staring blankly ahead. Around its neck hung a small wooden tag with the same symbol I'd seen carved into the trees. The laughter stopped. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut. The air grew cold, and a shadow moved across the room, though there was no light to cast it. Then I heard his voice, low and rasping, coming from right behind me. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the doll, now sitting upright, its head tilted toward me. I don't remember how I got out of the cabin or how I found the trail. All I know is that I ran until my legs gave out and my lungs burned. When I finally reached my car, the tires were slashed, and the same symbol was scratched into the driver's side door. I never went back to that forest, but sometimes, late at night, I hear laughter outside my window, and when I look, I see a faint reflection in the glass, of eyes that are too wide and a grin that's too big. I've always been fascinated by urban exploration, the thrill of discovering abandoned places, unraveling their secrets, and capturing hauntingly beautiful photos of forgotten spaces. Over the years, I'd explored countless locations, crumbling factories, deserted amusement parks, and derelict hospitals. But the house on Ash Lane was different. It was a local legend, the kind of place kids dared each other to visit on Halloween. Known as the Mirror House, it had been abandoned for decades, yet no one seemed to know its full story. Some said it had been a mansion owned by an eccentric collector who went insane. Others claimed it was cursed, a portal to something beyond our understanding. What intrigued me the most were the whispers about its unique feature. Every wall in the house was said to be covered in mirrors. No one could confirm it, though. Most people who claimed to have entered the house would simply say, "You don't want to go there," and refuse to elaborate. I decided to see it for myself. I arrived just before sunset. The house was exactly as I'd imagined, looming and decrepit, with shattered windows and ivy crawling up its sides. The air around it felt unnaturally still, and the faint smell of mildew and decay wafted from the open doorway. Inside, the rumors were true. Every wall was lined with mirrors. Some were cracked or tarnished, while others gleamed as if they'd been polished yesterday. The mirrors seemed to reflect more than just the room. They distorted the space, making it feel endless and labyrinthine. I moved cautiously, my footsteps echoing against the wooden floor. My flashlight's beam bounced off the mirrors, creating an intricate web of light and shadows. I expected to feel a sense of unease, but instead I was captivated. The craftsmanship of the mirrors was exquisite, their frames carved with intricate patterns that seemed almost alive. As I ventured deeper, I noticed something strange. My reflection wasn't entirely in sync with my movements. It was subtle at first, just a slight lag, as if the image was struggling to keep up. But the further I went, the more pronounced it became. I stopped in front of one particularly large mirror, its frame adorned with carved roses that seemed to writhe under the light. My reflection stared back at me, but when I raised my hand, it hesitated before mimicking the motion. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was a trick of the light, an optical illusion caused by the angles of the mirrors. I pressed on, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step. The house seemed to stretch endlessly, room after room, mirror after mirror, until I wasn't sure if I was walking in circles or if the house was somehow shifting around me. In one room, I found a spiral staircase leading down. The air grew colder as I descended, and the scent of damp earth filled my nostrils. At the bottom was a large circular room with a single mirror standing in the center. Unlike the others, this mirror was free of cracks and dust. Its surface was flawless, like a pool of black water. I approached cautiously, drawn to it despite the growing sense of dread. When I looked into it, I didn't see my reflection. Instead, I saw the room behind me, but it wasn't empty. A figure stood there, shrouded in shadow. I whipped around, but the room was empty. My heart raced as I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, closer now. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated and contorted. Its face was obscured, but its presence was suffocating. Then it moved. It stepped out of the reflection, its body emerging from the mirror's surface like liquid glass. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet and landing hard on the floor. The thing didn't walk. It glided toward me, its movements unnaturally smooth. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my flashlight swinging wildly as I bolted up the staircase. The house was no longer quiet. A low, guttural hum echoed through the halls, growing louder with every step I took. The mirrors began to ripple, their surfaces warping as if something on the other side was trying to break through. I reached the front door, only to find it closed and unyielding. The air grew heavy, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. Then I heard it, a voice, soft and melodic, calling my name. I turned and saw my reflection in one of the mirrors, but it wasn't me. The figure in the mirror smiled, its eyes gleaming with malice. It raised a hand and beckoned me closer. I don't remember how I got out of the house. The next thing I knew, I was outside, gasping for air. My car was parked exactly where I'd left it, but the keys were missing from my pocket. I ran. When I finally reached the main road, a passing driver picked me up and took me to the nearest town. I didn't tell them what had happened. They wouldn't have believed me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure in the mirror. Its twisted grin burned into my mind. A few days later, I went back to the house in broad daylight, determined to retrieve my car. But when I arrived, the house was gone. All that remained was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. I don't know what I saw in the mirror house, and I don't think I want to know. But sometimes, late at night, when I pass by a mirror, I catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there. Something watching, waiting. And I wonder if I ever really left. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance to escape the city and reconnect with nature. I'd spent weeks planning it, researching trails, packing gear, and convincing my two closest friends, Nate and Olivia, to join me. We were all desperate for a break, and the secluded nature reserve I'd found seemed perfect. No crowds, no cell service, just us and the wilderness. The drive out was uneventful, filled with laughter and anticipation. The reserve was located deep in the mountains, a place so remote it didn't even show up on most maps. That was part of the appeal. When we arrived, the dense forest towered around us, and the air smelled of pine and earth. We parked near the trailhead and began our hike. The first day was idyllic, warm sunlight filtering through the trees, the sound of birdsong, and the satisfying crunch of leaves underfoot. By late afternoon, we'd reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp. It was a small, open space surrounded by towering pines with a trickling stream nearby. As night fell, we gathered around a small fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The sky above was a tapestry of stars, the kind you can only see far from civilization. It was perfect. But things started to feel off the next day. It began subtly. While packing up camp, Olivia swore she heard someone whisper her name. She brushed it off as the wind, but Nate and I exchanged uneasy glances. We'd both felt it too, that sensation of being watched. The trail we followed became increasingly overgrown, as if it hadn't been used in years. The trees seemed to close in around us, their gnarled branches twisting into unnatural shapes. The air grew colder, and the cheerful chirping of birds was replaced by an eerie silence. By midday, we stumbled upon something unexpected, a wooden signpost pointing toward an old, weathered cabin deep in the forest. "No way this is on the map," Nate said, pulling out the printed trail guide. He was right. There was no mention of any cabin. "Should we check it out?" Olivia asked, her voice tinged with hesitation. Against our better judgment, we decided to investigate. The cabin was in worse condition than we'd expected. Its roof sagged and the windows were dark and broken. But there was something compelling about it, as if it was daring us to come closer. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint smell of rot. The floorboards creaked under our weight, and the walls were covered in strange carvings, symbols and runes none of us recognized. A tattered journal lay on a dusty table in the corner. Nate picked it up and began flipping through the pages. The writing was erratic, filled with frantic descriptions of shadows in the forest and whispers at night. The last entry read, "Don't trust the forest. It sees you." We left the cabin quickly, an unspoken agreement to pretend we hadn't seen the journal. But the forest didn't feel the same anymore. The shadows seemed deeper, darker, as if they were alive. Every snap of a twig made us jump, and the wind carried faint whispers we couldn't quite make out. By the time we decided to turn back, the sun was already setting. But no matter how far we walked, the trail didn't lead us back to the clearing. It was as if the forest had shifted, trapping us in an endless maze. As night fell, panic set in. Our flashlights barely pierced the darkness, and the trees seemed to press closer with every step. Then came the sounds, low, guttural growls echoing through the forest. They weren't animalistic, but something else entirely. "Did you hear that?" Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. Before we could answer, something darted between the trees. A fleeting shadow too fast to be human. We ran. Branches tore at our clothes and skin as we sprinted blindly through the forest. The growls grew louder, accompanied by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and far too many to count. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, we realized Nate was gone. We called his name, our voices echoing into the emptiness, but there was no response. Olivia was on the verge of tears, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "We can't just leave him," she cried. But we had no choice. The forest was alive with movement, shapes shifting in the corners of our vision. Staying in one place felt like inviting whatever was out there to find us. Hours blurred into an eternity. Olivia and I stumbled into a small clearing, collapsing to the ground in exhaustion. The night was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. Then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows. It was tall and humanoid, but its proportions were wrong. Its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Olivia," I whispered, but she was already staring at it, frozen in fear. The figure stepped closer, and in the beam of my flashlight, I saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. Its head was smooth and featureless like a mannequin, but it radiated a sense of malevolence that chilled me to my core. It raised an arm, pointing directly at me. I don't remember much after that. I woke up hours later, lying in a ditch near the trailhead. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the forest. My clothes were torn, my body covered in scratches, but Olivia was nowhere to be found. The authorities didn't believe my story. They chalked it up to exhaustion, maybe some sort of shared hysteria. Nate and Olivia were never found, and the forest was declared off-limits after several other hikers went missing in the following weeks. I've tried to move on, but the memories haunt me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers outside my window or catch a fleeting shadow in the corner of my eye, and I can't shake the feeling that the forest is still watching, waiting for me to come back. It started innocently enough. My friends and I had been talking about taking a road trip for months, exploring some off-the-beaten-path places. We wanted to visit the kind of towns people never mention, the kind where everything seemed frozen in time. So, when we came across a local legend about a forgotten town, we couldn't resist. The town was supposedly abandoned, a place no one had lived in for decades. There were rumors of strange occurrences, but nothing concrete. People would whisper about it in hushed tones, but no one had ventured there in years, as far as we knew. It was the perfect destination for a group of curious friends looking for an adventure. We set out on a Saturday morning, the car packed with snacks, cameras, and an excited sense of anticipation. We didn't know what to expect, just that we were ready for whatever this strange town had to offer. The drive took longer than expected, winding through dense forests and desolate roads. The farther we went, the more the world around us seemed to fade away. Cell service died, and the only sounds we could hear were the tires against the gravel and the occasional rustle of leaves. It felt like we were driving deeper into another time. Finally, as dusk began to settle, we saw it, just off the side of the road, a rusty sign that read, "Welcome to Rose Lake." The letters were weathered and faded, but it was clear that this town had once been a place. We parked the car and stepped out into the cool evening air. The silence was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the city noise we'd left behind. At first, everything seemed like it had just been forgotten. Houses lined the streets, their windows dark, their paint peeling, but intact. The roads were cracked and weeds grew through the asphalt, but there were no signs of destruction or decay, just abandonment. We wandered down the main street, laughing at the eerie quiet. We took pictures of the old storefronts and peeked inside empty windows. It wasn't until we reached the town square that things started to feel wrong. In the center of the square was an old fountain, the water still but covered with a thick layer of green algae. Surrounding it were benches, some of which were tipped over or broken. But it was the strange figure standing next to the fountain that caught our attention. It was a woman, old but not frail. She wore a long dark dress, and her face was hidden behind a veil. Her posture was stiff, unnerving, as though she was standing too still for too long. We watched her for a moment, unsure of whether we should approach. But before we could decide, she turned sharply and walked into one of the nearby buildings without a word. We froze. None of us had seen her move before, and the suddenness of her departure sent a chill down our spines. I turned to my friends, but they seemed just as confused and unsettled as I was. "Did you see that?" Max whispered, his voice barely audible. "I saw it," Claire responded, her voice shaky. "Should we follow her?" We debated for a few moments, unsure of what to do. But curiosity got the best of us. We made our way to the building the woman had entered. It was an old house, its door slightly ajar, as if inviting us in. The atmosphere was thick with an eerie energy, and the air felt heavy. I pushed the door open and it creaked loudly, sending a shiver through all of us. The house was dark, the only light coming from the slivers of sunlight that managed to sneak through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The interior was coated in dust, and it smelled musty, like it hadn't been touched in years. We called out, but there was no answer. Slowly, we explored the house, moving from room to room. Everything was just as still as it had been on the outside, but it felt like we were intruding. Each step we took felt wrong, like the house was watching us. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Soft, slow, almost imperceptible. But there. We froze. The sound came from upstairs. It was faint, but undeniable. My heart raced. "Did you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice barely a whisper. We nodded, but none of us moved. The air seemed to thicken with tension, and the weight of something unseen pressed against us. Slowly, we crept up the stairs, our footsteps loud in the silence. When we reached the top, the hallway stretched out before us, dark and narrow. The sound of the footsteps had stopped, but we could still feel something lingering. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar. We approached it slowly, my hand trembling as I reached out to push it open. The room beyond was empty, but something caught my eye. On the far wall, scrawled in faded red paint, was a word. Leave. It was then that I realized something was terribly wrong. The house, the town, the woman. Everything felt like it had been waiting for us, like we were never meant to leave. Suddenly, we heard the sound of a door slamming downstairs. We didn't hesitate any longer. We ran. We rushed back down the stairs, our footsteps echoing in the empty house. But when we reached the door, it wouldn't open. I pulled at the handle, panic rising in my chest, but it was stuck, sealed shut. Behind us, the footsteps grew louder. Someone, or something, was moving toward us. Finally, the door burst open and we ran out into the street. As we sprinted back to the car, I looked over my shoulder. The woman was standing in the doorway watching us leave. We didn't stop running until we were back in the car and speeding down the road. The town faded into the distance, but the feeling of being hunted didn't. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing there, following us. We didn't speak for a long time. The silence between us was heavy with the weight of what we'd experienced. The town was never mentioned again in any of the local stories. When I tried to find it on a map, it had disappeared, like it had never existed at all, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that one day it will find me again. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight. I hope you found some peace and comfort in the story. Before you drift off into sleep, I'd love to know what time it is where you are and which country you're watching from. Feel free to share in the comments. And, of course, don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling tales. Until next time, rest easy and sweet dreams.